We often feel like isolated islands, drifting in a vast sea of separate events. We imagine that our thoughts, our feelings, and our choices are entirely our own, disconnected from the pulse of the world around us. Yet, there is an ancient understanding that suggests otherwise, a teaching that describes life not as a collection of things, but as a flow of conditions. This is the heart of dependent origination, the profound realization that nothing exists in isolation. Everything we experience arises because of something else. And when those conditions cease, the experience dissolves. By looking closely at these links, we begin to see the hidden machinery of our own minds. Through this lens, we find the path to a lasting freedom. To understand how we are bound, we must look at the very root of our movement through the world. Imagine a deep forest at night where we wander without a lamp. This is the state of fundamental ignorance, not a lack of data or information, but a failure to see how reality actually functions. Because we do not see clearly, we begin to form mental constructions, those habitual patterns and intentions that push us to act, to speak, and to think in ways that reinforce a sense of a separate self. These intentions act like seeds planted in the soil of our consciousness. As this consciousness flows, it takes on a specific shape, what we call name and form, the intersection of the mental and the physical. From this intersection, the six senses emerge like windows opening in a house. Through these windows, we make contact with the world outside. Contact is the spark that ignites the fire of feeling. Every touch, every sound, every thought produces a ripple of pleasure, pain, or neutrality. It is here that the trap begins to close. When we feel pleasure, we reach out to grab it. When we feel pain, we pull away in fear. This reaching and pulling is craving, a thirst that can never be fully quenched because the objects we chase are constantly changing. Craving then hardens into clinging, where we wrap our identity around our desires, our opinions, and our possessions. We become so attached to these things that we believe they are who we are. This clinging fuels the process of becoming, the momentum that carries us into new roles, new conflicts, and new versions of ourselves. This momentum inevitably leads to birth, the manifestation of a new state of being that is destined to change. And because anything that is born must eventually decay, we find ourselves facing aging, death, sorrow, and despair. This is the wheel that turns without a beginning, a chain of events where each link depends on the one before it. We are not being punished by some external force. We are simply caught in a mechanical process of cause and effect that we do not yet understand. To break the chain, we do not need to fight the world. We need to understand the links that hold us together. When we see that our suffering is not a personal failure but a result of these conditions, the weight of the ego begins to lighten. We realize that we are not the masters of our house, but guests in a complex web of interactions that have been spinning since before we were born. This vision of the root is the first step toward a mind that is no longer shaken by the winds of change. Now we must ask ourselves why these patterns are so deeply ingrained in our biology and our psyche. If we look through the lens of modern science, we see that our brains were not designed for peace or for the realization of truth. They were designed for survival on a harsh and unforgiving planet. This is the hidden architecture of evolution, which mirrors the ancient teachings of the Buddha in startling ways. Our ancestors who were most anxious, most prone to craving, and most obsessed with status were the ones who survived to pass on their genes. The thirst for more was once a survival advantage, ensuring that we gathered enough food and secured our place in the tribe. But in the modern world, this same biological drive has become a source of endless dissatisfaction. We are walking around with ancient hardware trying to navigate a digital reality. The brain creates a sense of the self to act as a central command center for survival, a mental construct that constantly monitors for threats and rewards. This self is the ultimate illusion of dependent origination, a ghost in the machine that we mistake for a solid and permanent soul. When we look at a sunset or a beautiful face, our neurochemistry floods us with pleasure, and we immediately want to own that moment. We do not see the chemical reactions or the light waves. We only see something that we want or something that we fear losing. This biological conditioning is the physical manifestation of the mental formations described thousands of years ago. Every time we react with anger or greed, we are strengthening the neural pathways that keep us bound to the cycle of suffering. We are like laboratory animals pressing a lever for a reward that only provides a momentary spark of relief before the hunger returns. The genius of the Buddha to see that this process is not who we are, but simply a process that is happening. By analyzing the way our thoughts arise in response to sensory input, we can begin to create a space between the stimulus and the response. In that space, the power of the biological drive begins to wither. We no longer have to be slaves to the impulses of an organism that is only interested in its own continuation. This is the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern psychology, a deep dive into the mechanics of the mind that reveals how we are constructed by our past and our environment. We see that our personality is not a fixed monument, but a shifting weather pattern influenced by genetics, upbringing, and social conditioning. When we understand that our desires are often just echoes of ancestral needs, we can look at them with a sense of detachment and compassion. We are not bad people for feeling greed or fear. We are simply biological beings caught in a web of causes. This clarity allows us to stop taking our thoughts so personally, breaking the link between feeling and craving, and opening the door to a life of conscious choice rather than reflexive reaction. By observing the rise and fall of these states, we witness the true nature of existence as a dynamic and interconnected flow. When we turn our gaze toward the modern landscape, we see a world that is meticulously designed to exploit every link in the chain of dependent origination. Our society does not ask us to see reality as it is. Instead, it invites us to sink deeper into the dream of a permanent and independent self. We are told from childhood that we are the masters of our fate and that our value is measured by what we can accumulate and defend. This cultural narrative is the ultimate delusion, a collective agreement to ignore the interconnected nature of life in favor of a lonely and competitive struggle. Consider the digital mirrors we carry in our pockets. Every notification and every like is a calculated strike at the link of contact and feeling. The architects of these systems understand that if they can trigger a momentary spark of pleasure, they can create a craving that keeps us leaning into the future, waiting for the next hit of validation. We have become a civilization of hungry ghosts, wandering through a desert of symbols and images, trying to satisfy a spiritual hunger with material things. This is the critique we must face if we are to be truly honest with ourselves. We claim to want peace, yet we spend our days reinforcing the very walls that keep us isolated from the world and from each other. We cling to our opinions as if they were solid ground, forgetting that our views are merely conditioned responses to our unique history and circumstances. When someone disagrees with us, we feel it as a physical threat because we have built our identity out of these fragile thoughts. This clinging leads to a perpetual state of conflict, both within ourselves and in our relationships with others. We are so busy defending the fortress of the self that we never stop to notice that the fortress is empty. The teaching of the Buddha is not a soft lullaby to make us feel better about our lives. It is a sharp blade meant to cut through the layers of self-deception. It asks us to recognize that the person we think we are is actually a shifting collection of parts, none of which are permanent or under our total control. We see this clearly when we experience loss or illness. The body does not obey our commands to stay young, and the mind does not obey our commands to stay happy. By ignoring this truth, we set ourselves up for a lifetime of disappointment. We are like people trying to hold onto a handful of water. The tighter we squeeze, the faster it slips through our fingers. Our current way of living is a constant flight from the reality of change. We build monuments to our ego, and we seek security in wealth and status. Yet these are just more links in the chain that bind us to the cycle of anxiety and birth. To truly see the world is to realize that there is no one at the center of the experience, only the experience itself unfolding through 1,000 different causes and conditions. The realization that we are not separate islands but part of a continuous flow does not lead to a loss of meaning, but to the birth of a profound and unshakable resilience. When we stop trying to control the uncontrollable, we find a source of inner strength that is not dependent on external circumstances. This is the practice of applied awareness in the midst of our daily lives. It begins with the simple act of noticing the space between a feeling and a reaction. When a difficult emotion arises, we do not have to be swept away by it. We can look at the anger or the sadness as a weather pattern passing through the mind, acknowledging the conditions that brought it there without letting it define who we are. This shift in perspective creates a sense of connection with all other beings who are also struggling within their own chains of cause and effect. We begin to see that the person who cuts us off in traffic or speaks a harsh word is also a victim of their own conditioning, their own fears, and their own ignorance. This is not a passive acceptance of harm, but a clear-eyed understanding that allows us to respond with wisdom rather than blind reactivity. In our work and our relationships, we move from a state of grasping to a state of contribution. We understand that we are not working for the glorification of a small self, but participating in the larger movement of life. This clarity brings a natural calm to the mind because the stakes of the ego have been lowered. We are no longer terrified of failure because we see that success and failure are just temporary configurations of conditions. We are no longer desperate for praise because we know that the praise of others is as fleeting as the wind. This is the true nature of freedom, a mind that is spacious enough to hold both the joy and the sorrow of existence without being broken by either. We practice mindfulness not to reach a special state of trance, but to remain present for the reality of each moment as it arises and passes away. By staying at the point of contact, we can prevent the spark of feeling from turning into the fire of craving. We can feel the warmth of the sun or the sting of a cold wind and simply let them be what they are without needing to change them. This is how we live as a light unto ourselves, not by following a set of rules, but by seeing the truth of our own experience with such depth that the old habits of clinging naturally fall away. We become more effective in the world because our energy is no longer wasted on the defense of a phantom self. We are free to love more deeply because we are not looking for others to complete us or to validate our existence. We are already complete as a part of the whole. This is the ultimate gift of understanding dependent origination. The discovery that the peace we have been searching for in the future has always been available in the clear seeing of the present moment. We have traveled from the hidden roots of our suffering to the realization of a freedom that is available here and now. The teaching of the Buddha on dependent origination is not a philosophy to be studied from a distance, but a map of our own inner landscape. It invites us to look at the links of our lives with courage and honesty, recognizing that while we are shaped by the past, we are not imprisoned by it. By understanding the conditions that create our pain, we gain the power to create new conditions for peace and clarity. Let this awareness be your constant companion in every breath and every action. As you walk through the world, remember that you are a vital thread in an infinite tapestry, and that every act of mindfulness ripples out to touch everything that is. Many of us live with a quiet sense of exhaustion, as if we are chasing a horizon that always stays just out of reach. We seek stability in a world defined by movement, and we wonder why our hearts remain heavy despite our best efforts to secure happiness. This struggle is not a flaw in your character, but an ancient pattern woven into the very fabric of human existence. To find a way out, we must look at the hidden laws of cause and effect that govern our thoughts and the universe itself. The teaching of dependent origination offers a mirror to our own minds, revealing how every moment of suffering is built from a chain of invisible choices. By understanding these links, we can stop reacting to life and start seeing its true reality. At the core of our existence lies a deep and often silent misunderstanding of how the world functions, a state that ancient traditions call ignorance and modern science might describe as the evolutionary bias of the brain. We are biological entities shaped by millions of years of survival pressure, programmed to seek pleasure, avoid pain, and preserve the self at all costs. This programming served our ancestors well in the wild, yet it creates a perpetual state of dissatisfaction in the modern world because it relies on the illusion that things are solid and unchanging. When we look at a tree, a mountain, or even our own reflection, we see a distinct object that exists independently of everything else. However, this is a cognitive shortcut that obscures the reality of interconnectedness. Nothing exists in isolation. Every breath we take is a gift from the atmosphere. Every thought we think is a product of culture and biology. And every emotion we feel is a reaction to a web of causes that stretch back to the beginning of time. Because we fail to see this interdependence, we cling to things as if they could provide lasting security. We build our identities around our possessions, our status, and our opinions, believing that if we can just arrange the external world perfectly, we will finally be at peace. But this pursuit is like trying to catch the wind in a net. The more we try to grasp, the more we feel the friction of reality rubbing against our expectations. This friction is the essence of suffering, a subtle or sharp pain that arises whenever we demand that life be something other than what it is. Our brains are not designed to make us happy. They are designed to keep us alive. And survival requires a constant state of scanning for threats and seeking rewards. This evolutionary inheritance means that we are naturally prone to anxiety and greed. Yet we have the unique capacity to observe these patterns and choose a different path. To begin the process of inner transformation, we must first acknowledge the depth of our ignorance. We must admit that we do not see things as they are, but rather as we are, clouded by filters of past trauma, cultural conditioning, and biological imperatives. This admission is not a sign of weakness, but the first step toward a profound clarity. It is the moment we stop fighting the tide and start learning how the water moves. When we look deeply into the root of our actions, we find that almost every choice we make is driven by a desire to affirm a self that is actually a fluid process. We are not a fixed point in space, but a continuous flow of events, sensations, and perceptions. Recognizing this fluidity allows us to relax the grip we have on our rigid identities and open ourselves to a more expansive way of being. The root of suffering is not found in the world outside, but in the way we interpret that world through the narrow lens of the ego. By examining this root with patience and honesty, we begin to dismantle the scaffolding of our own discontent, making room for a resilience that does not depend on external circumstances, but on a clear understanding of the nature of change. The process of how we become entangled in this web of suffering can be broken down into a series of links that explain the mechanics of the human mind. Every experience begins with contact between a sense organ and its object, such as the eye seeing a color or the mind perceiving a thought. This contact is neutral in itself, but it immediately triggers a feeling tone that is either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. From an evolutionary perspective, these feeling tones are signals that tell us whether to move towards something for nourishment or move away from it for safety. However, in our complex psychological lives, we often lose control at the moment these feelings arise. When we encounter a pleasant sensation, a spark of craving is ignited. We want to hold on to the pleasure, to repeat it, and to intensify it. When we encounter an unpleasant sensation, we experience a spark of aversion. We want to push it away, to destroy it, or to escape from it. This reactive cycle of craving and aversion is where the momentum of our suffering builds. It is as if we are constantly reaching out to grab a handful of water, only to find that it slips through our fingers, leaving us frustrated and thirsty for more. This craving then leads to clinging, a state where we mentally latch onto objects, people, and ideas, trying to make them a permanent part of our self-definition. We cling to our youth, our social standing, and even our suffering because it gives us a familiar story to tell about who we are. This clinging solidifies into becoming, the process by which we take on roles and identities that further bind us to the cycle of birth and death of our own ego. Every time we say, "I am this," or "I want that," we are reinforcing the walls of a prison that we have built ourselves. The tragedy is that we do not realize the door is unlocked. We are so habituated to reacting that we forget we have the capacity for awareness. By slowing down and observing the gap between a feeling and a reaction, we can begin to interrupt this automatic chain of events. We can notice the pleasant sensation without needing to own it, and we can notice the unpleasant sensation without needing to flee from it. This is the practice of mindfulness in its most practical form. It is the ability to stand at the edge of the fire without being burned by the flames of our own desires. When we analyze our lives through this lens, we see that most of our stress is not caused by the events themselves, but by our resistance to the flow of time and change. We are like swimmers trying to move upstream against a powerful current, exhausting ourselves in a battle we cannot win. If we simply turn around and float with the current, we find that the same energy that was once our enemy becomes the force that carries us forward with ease. This shift in perspective requires a radical honesty about how our minds operate on a moment-to-moment basis. It asks us to look at our deepest cravings and ask ourselves if they have ever truly satisfied us in the long term. Most of the time, the answer is no. The relief we feel when we get what we want is usually just the temporary cessation of the pain of wanting. By understanding this mechanism, we can start to deconstruct the myths we tell ourselves about happiness and find a deeper, more stable peace that exists beneath the waves of our fluctuating emotions. We live in an age where our biological impulses are not just natural occurrences, but are being systematically mapped and exploited by the world around us. Our evolutionary drive to seek social validation and novelty is now being funneled into digital platforms that thrive on our attention and our discontent. Every notification, every curated image, and every algorithmic suggestion is a hook designed to snag our awareness and pull us deeper into the cycle of craving and aversion. We think we are choosing our desires, but often we are merely reacting to a sophisticated architecture of persuasion that understands our primal triggers better than we do ourselves. This modern environment creates a profound sense of fragmentation, leaving us feeling perpetually behind and fundamentally lacking. The critique we must face is that we have mistaken noise for meaning and speed for progress. We chase the ghost of a perfect life, while the actual life we are living passes us by unnoticed and unappreciated. The belief in a permanent, independent self is reinforced by a culture that tells us we are defined by what we own, what we achieve, and how we are perceived by others. This creates a fragile psyche that shatters at the first sign of criticism or loss because its foundation is built on the shifting sands of external approval. When we look closely at our digital reflections, we see a version of ourselves that is polished and static, yet our internal reality is one of constant flux and uncertainty. This disconnect is a primary source of modern anxiety. We are trying to maintain a solid image in a world that is inherently fluid. To break free from this trap, we must develop a critical awareness that questions the validity of our own impulses. We must ask if our cravings are truly ours, or if they are the products of conditioning and manipulation. Recognizing the emptiness of these external promises is not a cynical act, but a necessary step toward genuine clarity. It is the realization that no amount of consumption or validation can ever fill the void created by a lack of self-awareness. We are often like hungry ghosts in a realm of abundance, unable to be satisfied because we are looking for fulfillment in the very places that cause our hunger to grow. The illusion of the separate self is the ultimate barrier to our peace. It tells us that we are alone in our struggle and that we must compete with others to survive and thrive. However, when we see through this illusion, we realize that our well-being is inextricably linked to the well-being of everyone and everything around us. Our suffering is not a private tragedy, but a shared human experience that arises from common causes. By deconstructing the myths of modern individualism, we begin to heal the divide between ourselves and the world. This critical reflection allows us to step out of the frantic race for more and into a space of quiet observation, where we can finally see the intricate web of conditions that shape our lives without being caught in them like helpless prey. We learn to treat our thoughts not as absolute truths, but as passing weather patterns in the vast sky of our mind. This shift in perspective is the beginning of a mental revolution that restores our agency and allows us to live with a sense of purpose that is not dictated by the demands of the ego or the pressures of the marketplace. The path to an unshakable mind begins with the quiet observation of how things actually are rather than how we wish they were. When we truly understand the law of dependent origination, we gain a tool for navigating the complexities of modern life with grace and resilience. This is not a passive acceptance of fate, but an active engagement with the causes of our own experience. If we want to change the outcome of our lives, we must change the conditions that give rise to those outcomes. In our work, this means acting with intention rather than just reacting to pressure. We see that our success and failure are not final judgments on our worth, but are the results of 1,000 different factors, many of which are beyond our control. This realization allows us to work with diligence and focus without being paralyzed by the fear of falling short. In our relationships, this understanding transforms how we interact with those around us. When we see that others are also caught in their own chains of conditioning, our anger and resentment naturally give way to compassion. We recognize that the person who hurts us is often acting out of their own unexamined pain and ignorance. This does not mean we tolerate harm, but it means we respond with a clarity that seeks to heal the situation rather than escalate the conflict. We stop taking life so personally, realizing that the events that happen to us are not directed at us by a hostile universe, but are simply the unfolding of causes and effects. This is the source of true inner strength. It is the resilience of a mind that does not cling to its own expectations and therefore cannot be broken when those expectations are not met. We find a new kind of freedom that is not the freedom to do whatever we want, but the freedom from being enslaved by our own desires and fears. This freedom allows us to be fully present in every moment, whether it is a moment of joy or a moment of sorrow. We no longer have to run away from the difficult parts of life because we know that they too are temporary and conditioned. We can stand in the middle of a storm with a calm heart, knowing that the storm will pass and that our true nature is the vast and open space that remains untouched by the wind and rain. Practical mindfulness becomes the bridge between ancient wisdom and everyday action. It is the simple act of noticing the breath, the sensation of the feet on the ground, and the rising and falling of thoughts without judgment. This awareness creates a gap in the automatic cycle of reaction. In that gap lies the power to choose a different path, to speak a kinder word, to make a wiser decision, and to live a life that is aligned with our deepest values rather than our superficial cravings. As we cultivate this clarity, we find that our lives become simpler and more profound. We stop seeking the secret to a happy life and start living the reality of a meaningful one. This journey of seeing the true nature of reality is the most important work we can ever do, because it is the only work that leads to a peace that cannot be taken away by the world. We have traveled from the root of our biological conditioning to the heights of psychological liberation. Understanding dependent origination is not about memorizing a philosophy, but about experiencing a transformation in how we breathe, how we think, and how we love. It is the realization that we are not separate islands in a cold sea, but waves in an infinite ocean of interconnected life. When we let go of the need to control and the need to possess, we find that we are already held by the very universe we were trying to conquer. Carry this awareness into your day like a quiet lamp. Let it illuminate the small moments and the great challenges alike. Remember that you are a process of becoming, a beautiful and complex unfolding of causes. Be patient with yourself, be kind to others, and keep your eyes open to the truth that sets you free. We often feel like life is a series of accidents, a chaotic tumble of events that happen to us without our consent. Yet, there is a profound logic beneath the surface of our daily struggles. The Buddha spoke of a law that governs all existence, a principle known as dependent origination. It suggests that nothing arises in isolation, and every state of mind or circumstance has a specific cause. By understanding the architecture of our own suffering, we gain the power to dismantle it from the inside out. This is not about faith or mysticism, but about a clear-eyed observation of how things actually work. When we change the cause, the effect must inevitably change as well. This journey requires us to look past the symptoms of our dissatisfaction and find the hidden roots that keep us bound to the same repetitive patterns of thought and behavior. Through this lens, we discover the path to true freedom. To understand the root of our experience, we must first acknowledge that we are biological beings shaped by millions of years of survival pressure. Our minds were not designed for peace or enlightenment, but for the relentless pursuit of safety, food, and social standing. The Buddha identified this fundamental starting point as ignorance, which is not a lack of intelligence, but a profound misunderstanding of how reality functions. We perceive ourselves as solid, separate entities moving through a world of permanent objects. Yet everything we touch is in a state of constant flux. This basic error in perception triggers a chain reaction that defines our entire life. From ignorance arise mental formations, those deep-seated habits and biases that color every thought we have. These formations then give rise to consciousness, the spark of awareness that interacts with the world. But this consciousness is already tainted by our evolutionary baggage, seeking out what is pleasant and recoiling from what is painful. As consciousness meets the physical world through our senses, we begin to construct a narrative of who we are and what we need to survive. We are like builders who use old, cracked bricks to create a foundation, wondering why the house feels unstable during a storm. The 12 links of dependent origination show us that our suffering is not a single event, but a process that builds momentum with every passing second. When we do not see the process clearly, we become victims of our own biology. We react to the world instead of responding to it. This reactivity is the engine of our discontent, fueled by the ancient drive to keep moving, keep wanting, and keep becoming something else. We are caught in a cycle of birth and death, not just in a physical sense, but in the way our ego is born and dies 1,000 times a day through its attachments. To break this cycle, we must develop the courage to look at the very beginning of the chain. We must ask ourselves what it is we are failing to see about the nature of change. If we can recognize that our sense of a permanent self is an illusion created by these shifting conditions, the entire structure begins to wobble. The Buddha did not want us to believe this on blind faith, but to observe it in the laboratory of our own minds. Every time we feel a surge of anger or a pang of jealousy, we are witnessing the links of the chain pulling tight. By tracing the feeling back to its origin, we find that it did not appear out of nowhere. It was preceded by a perception, which was preceded by a contact, which was preceded by the sense organs themselves. This realization is the first step toward clarity. It allows us to stop blaming the outside world for our internal weather. We start to see that the world is simply providing the conditions, while our own internal patterns are providing the causes for our distress. This is the hard truth of the root, that we are the architects of our own prison, but we also hold the keys to the exit. By understanding the root, we stop trying to fix the symptoms and begin to address the fundamental misunderstanding that keeps us bound to the wheel of repetitive suffering. Once we understand the root of our ignorance, we must analyze the specific mechanism that turns a simple experience into a source of pain. This mechanism revolves around the bridge between feeling and craving. In the traditional teaching, this is where the cycle can most effectively be broken. Every moment of our lives, our senses are making contact with the environment. We see a face, we hear a sound, we smell the air, or we have a thought. This contact immediately produces a feeling tone, which is either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. From an evolutionary perspective, these feelings are survival signals. Pleasant feelings tell us to move towards something that might help us survive or reproduce, while unpleasant feelings tell us to move away from potential danger. This is a highly efficient system for a creature living in the wild, but it is a recipe for disaster in the modern world. Because we are hardwired to pursue the pleasant and avoid the unpleasant, we develop an intense craving for things to be different than they are. When we experience a pleasant feeling, we want it to last forever. When we experience an unpleasant feeling, we want it to vanish immediately. This craving is the pivot point of our suffering. It is the moment where we lose our balance and fall into the trap of attachment. We begin to cling to objects, people, ideas, and even our own identities as if they could provide us with lasting security. But because everything is subject to the law of change, our clinging inevitably leads to disappointment. We are like someone trying to hold water in their hands by squeezing as tight as possible, only to find that the harder we grip, the faster it slips through our fingers. This analysis reveals that the problem is not the feeling itself, but our reaction to it. We cannot stop feelings from arising any more than we can stop the wind from blowing. However, we can change how we relate to those feelings. This is where the practice of mindfulness becomes a revolutionary act. By observing the feeling tone without immediately jumping to craving or aversion, we create a space of freedom. We see the pleasant feeling arise, and we recognize it as a temporary phenomenon that will soon pass. We see the unpleasant feeling arise, and we recognize it as a temporary phenomenon that does not define us. In this space of non-reactive awareness, the chain of dependent origination is interrupted. We are no longer driven by the blind impulses of our evolutionary past. Instead, we develop a calm and unshakable mind that can remain centered in the midst of the inevitable ups and downs of life. This is the essence of inner strength. It is not the strength of a wall that resists the ocean, but the strength of the water itself that flows around every obstacle. When we analyze our lives through this lens, we see that most of our stress is self-generated through the habit of perception. We perceive a threat where there is only a change, and we perceive a loss where there is only a transition. By breaking the link between feeling and craving, we stop the momentum of the entire cycle. We begin to live with a sense of ease and clarity that was previously hidden behind the clouds of our own desires. This is not a state of indifference, but a state of profound engagement with reality as it is, rather than how we wish it to be. Through this analysis, we realize that the cause of our suffering is not the world outside, but the way we process our internal experience. As we look deeper into the architecture of our lives, we must confront a difficult truth that our modern culture often ignores. We are conditioned to believe that the path to happiness lies in the mastery of our external environment and the constant improvement of our personal brand. We are told that if we just work harder, earn more, and look better, we will finally reach a plateau of lasting satisfaction. However, evolutionary psychology and Buddhist wisdom both suggest that this is a fundamental deception. Our biology does not care about our happiness. It only cares about our survival and the transmission of our genes. This is why we are trapped on what psychologists call the hedonic treadmill, where every achievement provides only a fleeting burst of dopamine before the mind resets to a state of wanting. We are like hungry ghosts in a world of shadows, chasing after things that can never truly nourish us because they are as transient as the morning mist. The critique of the Buddha goes even deeper by challenging the very existence of the one who is doing the chasing. We speak of my life, my feelings, and my success as if there were a solid, unchanging self at the center of it all. But when we look closely, we find only a stream of perceptions, memories, and reactions that are entirely dependent on external conditions. This sense of being a separate controller is the ultimate illusion that causes us to suffer. We spend our entire lives defending a fortress that has no inhabitant. We protect our ego from perceived insults and feed it with praise. Yet this ego is nothing more than a temporary byproduct of the 12 links of dependent origination. When we realize that there is no fixed self to protect, the burden of life begins to lift. We no longer have to take everything so personally because we see that events are just the result of causes and conditions playing out. This critique is not meant to make us feel small or insignificant, but to liberate us from the exhausting task of maintaining a false identity. We see that our anger is not who we are, but a conditioned response to a perceived threat to our self-interest. We see that our anxiety is not a flaw in our character, but a biological alarm system that has been calibrated too high by a stressful environment. By deconstructing the self, we find a deeper sense of connection to the world around us. We are not islands in a hostile sea, but waves in a vast and interconnected ocean of existence. This shift in perspective is the essence of humility. It allows us to stop fighting against the flow of reality and start moving with it. We recognize that the pursuit of permanent pleasure in an impermanent world is a mathematical impossibility. Instead of trying to fix the world to suit our desires, we begin the work of transforming our own minds. This is the only way to find a peace that does not depend on everything going our way. It is a peace that comes from the end of the struggle to be someone special, and the beginning of the simple joy of being present without the need for an agenda. We see that the cause of our pain was never the world itself, but the impossible expectations we placed upon it through our attachment to an illusory self. To change the cause is to intervene in the very moment that our experience is being formed. This is the practical application of the wisdom of the Buddha in our modern lives. It begins with the development of a sharp and penetrating awareness that can catch the mind in the act of clinging. Most of us live our lives on autopilot, reacting to every stimulus with the same tired patterns that we learned in childhood or inherited from our ancestors. But when we bring the light of awareness to the process of dependent origination, we discover a tiny gap between the feeling and the reaction. In that gap lies our entire potential for transformation. When someone speaks a harsh word to us, we feel the unpleasant sensation in our chest or throat. Usually, the next link in the chain would be the arising of anger and the desire to strike back. But if we can stay with the sensation itself, observing its heat and its pressure without labeling it as my anger, the chain is broken. The cause has been changed from ignorance to wisdom, and the effect is no longer suffering but a calm and measured response. This practice applies to every area of our existence, from our professional lives to our most intimate relationships. In our work, we stop being driven by the fear of failure or the greed for recognition, and we start focusing on the quality of our actions in the present moment. We see that success and failure are just conditions that arise and pass away, and our worth is not tied to either of them. In our relationships, we stop trying to control our partners or children to satisfy our own needs for security. Instead, we see them as complex beings with their own chains of causes and conditions, and our hearts open with a natural and effortless compassion. This is the true meaning of inner strength. It is a mind that is so clear and so grounded in reality that it cannot be shaken by the storms of life. We are no longer like dry leaves blown about by the wind of our emotions, but like a mountain that remains still while the clouds pass by its peak. This transformation does not happen overnight, but through the consistent application of awareness to the small details of our daily lives. Every time we choose to breathe instead of reacting, every time we choose to let go instead of clinging, we are rewiring our brains and dismantling the ancient structures of suffering. we are moving from a life of bondage to a life of resilience. This resilience is not a hardening of the heart, but a softening of the ego. It is the ability to face the pain of the world with an open heart because we no longer fear that it will destroy us. We understand that pain is a condition of being alive, but suffering is an optional reaction that we can choose to set down. By changing the cause at the level of our perception and our craving, we fundamentally alter the trajectory of our lives. We become a source of peace for ourselves and for everyone we encounter. The wisdom of the Buddha is not a set of rules to follow, but a map of the mind that allows us to find our own way home to a state of balance and clarity that has always been our true nature. The journey of understanding dependent origination is the journey of becoming truly human. It is the path from being a victim of our circumstances to being a witness of the process. As you move through your day, remember that every moment is an opportunity to see the links of the chain and to choose a different way of being. You do not need to change the world to find peace. You only need to change the way you relate to the world. Look deeply into the nature of your own mind, and you will find that the freedom you have been seeking is already here, waiting in the space between your thoughts. May you walk this path with patience and kindness, knowing that every step you take toward awareness is a step toward the end of suffering for all beings. Many of us feel like we are moving through a dense fog, reacting to shapes and sounds without ever understanding the source of our own behavior. We often wonder why we repeat the same painful patterns, or why a persistent sense of unease follows us even in our best moments. This is not a personal failure, but a simple lack of clarity regarding the hidden architecture of the human mind. The Buddha provided a profound map called dependent origination to help us decode the invisible chains of cause and effect that bind us. It is an invitation to move beyond reactive survival and enter a state of profound wisdom. By observing how one sensation leads to a thought and how our history shapes our present, we gain the power to be still. Let us examine the mechanics of our own existence. At the core of our existence lies a subtle blindness that shapes every decision we make and every breath we take. This is not an absence of information or a lack of intellectual capacity, but rather a fundamental misperception of how reality functions. We see things as permanent when they are shifting, and we see them as independent when they are deeply interconnected. This primordial ignorance is the soil in which all our mental formations grow. From an evolutionary perspective, our ancestors developed survival mechanisms that prioritized quick judgments over deep truth. The brain was wired to find threats and opportunities, not to perceive the empty nature of the self. These inherited patterns of thinking and reacting create a momentum that carries us from one moment to the next. When we look at our modern lives, we can see these ancient currents flowing through our digital interactions and our professional ambitions. We are driven by a consciousness that is always seeking a foundation to stand upon. This consciousness does not exist in a vacuum, but arises in conjunction with the physical body and the mental faculties that define our human experience. Think of it as a river that appears constant, but is actually a flow of ever-changing water. The five senses and the mind act as windows through which we perceive the world. And yet these windows are often tinted by our past experiences and our genetic predispositions. When our senses meet an object, a spark is struck. This contact is the bridge between the external world and our internal landscape. Without this meeting, there would be no experience. Yet we often forget that the world we perceive is a construction of our own cognitive architecture. We assume that what we see is the objective truth, ignoring the fact that our biological heritage has filtered that truth through the lens of survival and reproduction. By understanding this link, we begin to cultivate an inner strength that is not based on brute force, but on the profound realization of our own conditioning. We start to see that our reactions are not inevitable. They are the result of a long chain of events that started long before we were even aware of them. This awareness is the first crack in the armor of the ego. It allows us to pause and reflect on the silent forces that drive our anger, our fear, and our desperate need for validation. As we peel back the layers of this causal process, we find that there is no solid core at the center of the storm. There is only the process itself, a dance of conditions and effects that repeats endlessly until we bring the light of wisdom to bear upon it. This is the root of our suffering and also the root of our potential for liberation. If we can see the chain of causality clearly, we can begin to find the places where the links are weak. We can learn to stand in the middle of the fire without being consumed by it. This is the beginning of the journey toward a mind that is truly unshakable. Once contact is made between our senses and the world, a feeling inevitably arises. This feeling is not yet a complex emotion, but a simple tone of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. It is a basic biological signal telling us whether to move towards something or away from it. In the modern landscape, these signals are constantly being hijacked by the world around us. Our devices and our consumer culture are designed to trigger pleasant feelings that lead directly to craving. This craving is a powerful thirst. It is the desire for things to be different than they are, or the desperate wish to hold on to a fleeting moment of joy. When we experience a pleasant sensation, we want more of it. When we experience an unpleasant one, we want it to end immediately. This is the mechanism of addiction that manifests not only in substances, but in our obsession with status, approval, and digital stimulation. Craving is the engine that drives the cycle of suffering. It creates a tension within us that demands to be resolved. If we do not examine this tension, it grows into clinging. We cling to our opinions, our possessions, and most of all, our sense of who we think we are. This clinging is a form of mental grasping that tries to freeze the world in place. We want our relationships to stay the same and our bodies to never age. From an evolutionary standpoint, this grasping helped our ancestors secure resources and maintain social bonds, but in our current reality, it leads to a chronic state of dissatisfaction. We are constantly trying to build a fortress out of sand. This clinging then feeds into the process of becoming. We are always trying to become something else. Someone more successful, more attractive, or more enlightened. We build an identity based on our desires and our attachments, forgetting that this identity is a fluid and shifting process. This process of becoming leads to the birth of a new state of being, which carries with it the inevitable seeds of decay and loss. Every time we tie our happiness to a specific outcome or a temporary self-image, we set the stage for future sorrow. True insight comes when we recognize that the self we are so eager to protect is actually a collection of patterns that arise and pass away according to conditions. When we stop trying to control every outcome and instead observe the flow of our cravings, we find a new kind of freedom. We begin to see that we do not have to be a slave to our biological impulses. We can feel a sensation without turning it into a craving. We can experience a desire without turning it into an identity. This analysis of the mind allows us to break the momentum of the habit loops that define our lives. It gives us the space to breathe and to choose a different way of being in the world. A way that is grounded in reality rather than in the desperate pursuit of shadows. By understanding the mechanics of our own hearts, we can finally start to live with a sense of peace that does not depend on everything going our way. The modern world encourages us to believe that we are the absolute masters of our fate. We are told from a young age that we are independent individuals with a fixed identity that must be expressed and protected at all costs. However, when we apply the lens of dependent origination, this narrative begins to crumble. We see that our personality is not a solid block of stone, but a fragile mosaic of social conditioning, biological urges, and reactive thoughts. Evolutionary psychology reminds us that our sense of self was not designed for happiness, but for competition and reproduction. We are biological machines programmed to keep wanting more because those who were easily satisfied did not survive as effectively as those who were restless. This restlessness is what we now call ambition or progress, yet it often leaves us hollow and exhausted. The critique here is not that we should stop striving, but that we should stop believing the lie that the self is the center of the universe. When we look at our frustration with our careers or our disappointment in our partners, we are usually reacting to a violation of an image we have created. We have a mental blueprint of how things should be, and when reality does not match that blueprint, we suffer. This is the ultimate trap of the ego. It convinces us that our suffering is caused by the external world rather than our internal grasping. We blame the economy, our upbringing, or our luck, failing to see that the primary cause is the way we process experience. In the Western context, this individualism is often worn as a badge of honor, yet it is often the very thing that isolates us and makes us vulnerable to anxiety. We are taught to be self-reliant, yet we are dependent on a million invisible threads of connection. To see the truth of dependency is to realize that there is no me without a you, no breath without the air, and no thought without the language we inherited. This realization is not a loss of power, but a shift in perspective that allows us to drop the heavy burden of being a separate self. We no longer have to defend a fortress that was never there in the first place. Instead, we can interact with the world with a sense of lightness and curiosity. We can see our biases and our fears as temporary weather patterns passing through an open sky. This critique of the self is the most compassionate act we can perform for ourselves. It frees us from the impossible task of maintaining a perfect image in an imperfect world. By letting go of the need for absolute control, we find a stability that is far more resilient than any ego could ever provide. We stop fighting the river and learn to swim with the current of reality. This is where true intelligence begins, not in the accumulation of facts, but in the dismantling of the illusions that keep us small and afraid. As we reach the end of this exploration, we must ask how we can live this truth in a world that is designed to distract us. The answer lies in the practice of applied awareness. This is not something that only happens on a meditation cushion, but something that must be brought into the boardroom, the kitchen, and the bedroom. It starts with the simple act of noticing the gaps between the links of dependent origination. We learn to notice the sensation before it becomes a craving. We learn to notice the craving before it becomes an action. This tiny space is where our freedom lives. In that moment of observation, the chain of causality is interrupted. We realize that just because we feel an impulse to speak harshly or to check our phones for the 100th time, we do not have to follow it. This is the birth of true mental autonomy. When we live with this clarity, our relationships transform because we no longer expect others to fill the holes in our own hearts. We see them as they are, as fellow travelers caught in their own webs of conditioning, and our judgment is replaced by a natural compassion. In our work, We become more effective because we are no longer paralyzed by the fear of failure or the greed for success. We simply do what needs to be done with a mind that is clear and focused. This is the ultimate training of inner strength. It is not a mind that is numb to the world, but a mind that is fully engaged, yet remains unattached to the outcome. We walk through the world like a person who knows the secret of the magician and is therefore no longer fooled by the trick. We still enjoy the beauty of the performance, but we are no longer deceived by the illusion. This path is not an escape from life, but an entry into it. It is a way of living that is both deeply rational and profoundly intuitive. We stop searching for a permanent happiness in a world of change and instead find a peace that exists within the change itself. This peace is the fruit of wisdom, a state of being that is not shaken by the ups and downs of fortune. By recognizing the law of dependent origination, we have found the map to the exit of the labyrinth. The journey out is not a movement in space, but a shift in how we see. As we continue to look into the nature of reality, the walls of our prison begin to dissolve. We find that the liberation we were seeking was always present, waiting for us to stop grasping at shadows and finally open our eyes. This is the legacy of the Buddha, a practical and timeless guide to becoming truly human. Carry this reflection with you as you move back into the noise of your day. Remember that every moment is a fresh opportunity to observe the chain of cause and effect. You do not need to change the world to find peace. You only need to change the way you relate to your own experience. The wisdom of dependent origination is not a distant goal, but a living presence. It is the quiet voice of reason that speaks in the middle of the storm. Trust in your capacity to see clearly. Trust in the resilience of a mind that has found its own center. May you walk with clarity and find the freedom that has always been yours. Have you ever felt like a spectator in your own life, watching events unfold as if they were dictated by a roll of the dice? We often use the word luck to explain the things we cannot control. The sudden loss, the unexpected windfall, or the meeting that changed everything. But if we look closer, we find that the concept of luck is often a shadow cast by our own lack of understanding. The Buddha taught that we live in a world of profound order, not the order of a divine judge, but the order of cause and effect. This is the law of dependent origination. It tells us that nothing arises from nothing. Every moment is linked to 1,000 others, and by seeing these links, we can stop being victims of chance and start becoming masters of our own minds. The core of the teachings of the Buddha rests upon the law of dependent origination, which states that when this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. This simple formula describes a universe of total interconnectedness where no single thing possesses an independent or permanent essence. We often imagine ourselves as solid, separate entities moving through a world of other solid objects. But the Buddha suggests that we are more like a river or a flame. A river appears to be a single thing, yet the water within it is constantly changing. A flame appears to have a shape and a life of its own, yet it cannot exist without fuel, heat, and oxygen. If you remove one condition, the flame vanishes. Our lives operate on the same principle. Our thoughts, our emotions, and our physical bodies are the results of a vast and complex meeting of conditions that have been gathering for eons. When we look at a tree, we might see a lone object standing in a field, but a deeper look reveals that the tree is actually made of non-tree elements. It is composed of sunlight, rain, soil, minerals, and the labor of countless microbes in the earth. Without the sun, there is no tree. Without the clouds, there is no tree. The tree does not have a separate self. It is a manifestation of the entire cosmos coming together in a specific way at a specific time. We are no different. Our joys and our sorrows are not random accidents of luck, but are the fruits of specific seeds we have planted or conditions we have encountered. This perspective shifts our focus from complaining about our circumstances to understanding the roots of our experiences. It asks us to look closely at the 12 links of causation that the Buddha identified, starting with ignorance and leading all the way to birth, aging, and death. Ignorance is the primary condition that sets the entire wheel in motion. It is not a lack of information, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how things exist. We ignore the fact that everything is changing and interconnected, and instead, we cling to the idea of a permanent self that must be protected and gratified at all costs. This clinging creates a chain reaction of craving and attachment that inevitably leads to suffering because we are trying to hold on to things that are by their very nature flowing away from us. To see this chain clearly is the first step toward breaking it. When we realize that our suffering is not a matter of bad luck, but a matter of cause and effect, we gain the power to change the causes. We stop being victims of the universe and start becoming conscious participants in the unfolding of our own lives. This is the ground of true resilience because it does not depend on things going our way. It depends on our ability to see the truth of how things are and to act with wisdom within that reality. Every action we take and every thought we harbor becomes a condition for the future, creating a web of causality that defines our path forward through the world. To truly understand why we struggle so much with this concept, we must look at the way our minds have been shaped by the long process of evolution. Evolutionary psychology tells us that our brains were not designed to perceive the ultimate truth of emptiness or interconnectedness. Instead, they were designed for survival in a world that was often dangerous and unpredictable. Our ancestors needed to make split-second decisions about what was a threat and what was a resource. To do this effectively, the brain developed a series of cognitive shortcuts and biases that help us navigate the world but also hide the true nature of reality from us. We are biologically wired to see ourselves as the center of the universe because that perspective helped our ancestors protect their own lives and pass on their genes. This deep-seated ego is not a moral failing but a survival mechanism that has outlived its primary usefulness in the modern world. Our brains are constantly looking for patterns and causes, often attributing events to luck or to the intentions of others because it is easier for our minds to process a simple story than a complex web of infinite conditions. When we experience a setback, our evolutionary programming triggers a stress response, making us feel as though we are under attack. We feel that the world is unfair or that we have been singled out by misfortune. This is the illusion of the separate self crying out in fear. The Buddha recognized this psychological trap long before modern science could explain it. He saw that our perception is filtered through our past experiences, our desires, and our biological drives. This filtering process creates a distorted view of reality where we see permanent things where there is only change, and where we see independent objects where there is only connection. Consider the way we perceive emotions. When anger arises, we usually say, "I am angry." This small phrase reinforces the idea of a solid self that possesses a solid emotion. But if we analyze the anger using the lens of dependent origination, we see that it is not a part of us. It is a temporary state that arose because of a specific set of conditions, perhaps a lack of sleep, a misinterpreted comment from a friend, and a biological predisposition toward a quick temper. If any of those conditions were different, the anger would not be there. By deconstructing our experiences in this way, we begin to see that there is no fixed person inside of us who is having these experiences. There is only the experience itself, arising and passing away based on causes and conditions. This analysis is not meant to make us feel cold or detached, but to give us the space to respond rather than react. When we stop seeing our thoughts and feelings as our identity, we are no longer at their mercy. We can observe the arising of a craving or a fear and understand that it is just a conditioned response of an ancient brain trying to do its job. We can look at our lives and see that what we called luck was simply the intersection of our choices and the environment we inhabit. This clarity allows us to break free from the cycles of hope and despair that characterize the unexamined life. We realize that we do not need to fight against the universe or beg for better luck. We only need to understand the conditions that lead to suffering and the conditions that lead to freedom. The concept of luck is often a psychological shield we use to protect ourselves from the overwhelming complexity of existence. When we say someone is lucky, we are essentially admitting that we cannot see the invisible threads of effort, timing, and environment that led to their success. This critique goes deep into the heart of our modern world, where we celebrate the self-made individual or lament the victim of circumstance. From the perspective of the Buddha, both views are flawed because they rely on the myth of a separate actor who is either winning or losing against a random universe. Evolutionary psychology suggests that our ancestors benefited from attributing events to external agency. If a bush rustled, it was safer to assume it was a predator rather than just the wind. This tendency to assign meaning or agency where there is only natural cause and effect has stayed with us through the ages. We treat luck as a mystical substance that some people possess and others lack, creating a sense of entitlement or a sense of worthlessness that has no basis in truth. But when we look through the lens of dependent origination, we see that luck is simply the name we give to causes we have not yet identified or understood. It is a placeholder for ignorance. If a person wins a lottery, we call it luck, but it is actually the result of their physical presence at a certain store, the specific movement of a machine, the mathematical laws of probability, and the social structures that created the game in the first place. To call it luck is to stop looking at the reality of the situation and to ignore the interconnected nature of all things. This mental laziness prevents us from taking responsibility for the internal conditions that we can actually influence and change. While we cannot control every external variable in this vast universe, we can control our reaction to them and the mental states we cultivate within ourselves. The critique here is sharp and uncompromising. By clinging to the idea of luck, we remain children in a world of giants, hoping for a kind master to grant us a wish rather than learning to walk on our own 2 feet with clarity. We must recognize that our current life is the sum total of infinite previous conditions, and our future life will be the result of what we do in this very moment with our minds. This is not a burden, but a profound liberation for those who seek the truth. It means that the door to change is always open because the conditions are always shifting and flowing. We are not trapped by a fixed destiny or a cruel fate. We are simply part of a flow that can be understood and directed through the power of wisdom and practice. When we stop blaming luck for our failures, we start looking at our own intentions and the quality of our attention in each moment. we begin to see that even our failures are rich with information about the conditions we need to adjust for the future. This shift in thinking requires a radical honesty that the ego often resists with all its strength, because it is much easier to say I was unlucky than to say I was unmindful or I was unprepared for the reality of the situation. Yet, in that honesty lies the seed of an unshakable mind that no longer fears the changing winds of life or the uncertainty of the future. By letting go of the myth of luck, we step into the light of truth and begin the real work of transformation. The ultimate goal of seeing the world through the lens of dependent origination is the development of a mind that is no longer shaken by the dualities of gain and loss, fame and disrepute, praise and blame, or pleasure and pain. This is the applied awareness that brings clarity into every corner of our existence and allows us to live with grace. When we understand that our relationships are not a matter of finding the right person by luck, but are a reflection of the conditions we bring to every interaction, we transform the way we love and connect with others. We stop looking for someone to complete us and start looking at how our own habits of mind create harmony or discord in the world around us. In our work and our passions, we stop chasing the illusion of a final success and begin to value the process of creating the right causes every single day. This is how we build a resilient mind. By grounding ourselves in the truth of how things are rather than how we wish them to be in our fantasies. The Buddha did not ask us to believe in him or follow any doctrine. He asked us to test his teachings in the laboratory of our own lived experiences. When you feel a moment of suffering arising in your heart, stop and ask yourself what conditions are present right now to sustain it. Look at the physical sensations in your body, the thoughts passing through your mind, and the external environment that surrounds you. You will see that the suffering is not a solid thing, but a temporary formation held together by specific threads of cause and effect. As you identify those threads through deep reflection, they begin to lose their power over you and eventually dissolve. This is the practice of seeing the true nature of reality to break free from the illusions that cause us so much unnecessary pain and confusion. We realize that the ego we have spent so much energy defending is itself a conditioned phenomenon. A collection of memories, desires, and biological impulses that has no permanent or independent core. This realization brings a sense of vast lightness and compassion for ourselves and for all beings who are caught in the same cycle. We see that everyone else is also caught in the same web of conditions, acting out their own programming and struggling with their own lack of awareness. We no longer see enemies or villains, only people who are suffering because they do not yet see the law of cause and effect clearly. This multidimensional thinking allows us to navigate life with a calm heart and a sharp mind that sees through the noise. We become like a mountain that remains still whether the sun shines or the storm rages against its peaks. The storm is not an attack on the mountain. It is simply the result of atmospheric conditions coming together in a certain way. By internalizing this wisdom, we move from a state of constant reaction to a state of profound and lasting peace. We recognize that we have the capacity to shape our world by shaping our own minds and intentions. Every moment of mindfulness is a new cause that leads to a new and more peaceful effect in our lives and the lives of others. This is the path to an unshakable mind. A journey that begins with the simple recognition that nothing is a matter of luck and everything is a matter of understanding the truth. As we move forward from this reflection into the world, let us carry the clarity of dependent origination into our daily lives and actions. Remember that you are not a leaf in the wind, but part of the wind itself and the trees and the earth below in one great dance. When you face challenges, do not look for luck to save you. Look for the causes you can change. When you find joy, do not fear its loss or cling to it, but understand the conditions that brought it to your door so you may cultivate it again. By living with this awareness, you transform your existence into a masterpiece of wisdom and peace that cannot be taken away by the world. The path is clear and open before you, and the power to walk it has always been within you. Simply open your eyes and see the truth for yourself.